think I wrote down verse 36.
I got 13 more.
Then Daniel. Good Lord.
Verse 13?
Yeah.
I marked 36. It was 36.
I think we got to 13 the first time, then we got to 36.
Like, that could have been last time you started.
Yeah. And so now we got 36 to 49. And then if we get to there, I've got notes for that burning fiery furnace if we get to it. Okay, so yeah, we're continuing studying Daniel. And so now what's coming up is, last week I was at the beach with them boys. Well, my 3 older girls, the grandboys, and the little girl. None of the guys were able to go. Corey couldn't get off. He just changed. He drives, so he just started working with Avery. And so he's like low man on a totem pole now. And Justin, we had a mess up in his days off, and so he got messed up. He couldn't go. And Jacob, of course, was in the middle of the Indian Ocean.
Oh, he couldn't come over.
So he couldn't go either. So anyway, the 2 daughters-in-laws and Danielle and the grandkids were at the beach last week, and they wore me out. So that week is always about the grands. Now what's coming up is going to be about me and Miss Pam. And so we're going to Alaska. And then that trip starts on August 5th or 6th, whatever Friday of that week is. That'd be 4th. All right, August 4th. So I will be here again on August 2nd. But then I will miss like 3 Sunday schools in a row because of the way that trip goes. We'll actually be traveling home on that 3rd Sunday, but I won't be here. So in my Sunday school class, I'm going to be leaning on Randy and John and whoever else help. But anyway, y'all get a heads up on that. But anyway, I will be here for like 3 Wednesday nights, and then I'll be gone 2 for Wednesday nights. And then we'll continue our study in Daniel when I get back. Okay, so we got to verse 35, and I wrote down on the board that we were supposed to start at verse 36. And so all this prior to that is Daniel is telling Nebuchadnezzar what the dream was. See, we recall that he had the dream, so he calls in all the magicians and the soothsayers, right, the Chaldeans, and he wants to be sure that they can tell what this dream means. And so he demands that they tell him what the dream was. That was pretty good, wasn't it, Hardy?
Very much so.
Because Nebuchadnezzar would be like, if you could tell me what the dream is, then I'll be confident that you can tell me the interpretation. And he wasn't having it no other way. And so in verses 31 to 35, Daniel is telling Nebuchadnezzar, well, here's what you dreamed. And then in verse 36, where we pick it up tonight, Daniel says, that was the dream. Now I'm going to tell you what it means. So there's where we are. So in verse 36 it says, this is the dream, now we will tell. And notice what Daniel says there? He didn't say, now I will tell. I mean, it's clear that he says, now we will tell. Well, he didn't have no rat in his pocket. He had God on his side. So he says, now we will tell the interpretation for the king. You, O king, are a king of kings. And so that's a pat on the back award there. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. Now that's pretty strong words there. Daniel is saying, God gave you this. God's the one that put you in power. Even though he was an unbeliever, he's a despot, he's fickle, he's power hungry. I mean, he's got a lot of problems. But being boss ain't one of them. He knows who the king is, and it's him. But anyway, Daniel said, God gave you this kingdom. God gave you your power. God gave you your wisdom. God gave you your intellect, your strength, every talent and ability God gave you. And he gave you all this glory. Now we certainly can apply that, even though we're talking about a despotic king here, an unbelieving king at this point. We can still make an application to our lives, right? Whatever talents or abilities God has given you is from God. And you can't claim that I did it. What did Nebuchadnezzar eventually say? Is this not great Babylon that I have built? And God said, okay, I'll touch one little blood vessel in your brain, and you'll be eating grass like an ox. And your toenails and fingernails grew out like an eagle's talons. And God showed him who was king. God showed him who's in control. God showed him who has power. And so that's a lesson that we need not forget. God gave us all of our talents and abilities, and he should get the honor for it. And wherever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field, the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. And so Nebuchadnezzar then is being informed by Daniel that God gave you all this, and that the entire kingdom is basically under your control, and they are depending on you to make this work. In another place, the Bible talks about how he represents this huge tree, and the birds of the air nest in it, and the birds of all the other animals rest under it and find shelter under it. In other words, he was saying you are providing for all these masses of people. They're depending on you. And so, children of men, the beasts of the field, the birds of heaven, he has given them into your hand. They're your responsibility. You're ruling over them. And he said, and you're this head of gold. And so the head of gold, we made a chart up here, represents the Babylonian Empire and Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar is called the King of Kings. He was politically the best king because he was king. He was a monarch. He made up the rules and he enforced the rules. And he changed rules when he felt like changing them. I mean, that's power. Now, he used it in unwise ways, but being king is politically the best political system. But there are some caveats. It depends on who the king is as to whether this thing works well or not. You know, if Hitler's king, probably wouldn't work too well. But if Jesus Christ is king, it's going to work perfectly. Because he rules perfectly. He makes the rules perfectly. He enforces the rules fairly and justly and perfectly. So politically, a monarchy, a dictatorship, in other words, where there's a king, is politically the best political system. And that's the way it's going to be one day. Jesus Christ is going to sit on the throne, and he's going to be king. and it's going to be righteous. And so the reason we in America have a democratic republic is because that might be the next best thing to a righteous ruling dictatorship. Our founding fathers knew quite well there wasn't nobody capable of being a righteous ruler. And so that's why we have a democratic republic that we're trying to destroy every day, and seemingly getting closer all the time. All right, so he starts with Nebuchadnezzar and explains that the image is of a man because this image represents the history of human civilization. So there's a head of gold, there's chest and arms of silver, and then there's the belly and thighs of bronze, and then the legs of iron. And I think I mentioned that the arms are be symbolic of the fact that it's a Medo-Persian empire. They controlled it together. And there's two legs. Well, the Roman Empire eventually was divided into, in 395 AD, it was divided east and west. And so the Byzantine Empire then was referred to as the East, and Constantinople was the capital, and the western part of Rome, the capital was Rome. And so there's the inference of the two legs. Feet of clay eventually become, that includes the toes, so that eventually becomes a reference to the fact that the new revived Roman Empire into the future is the old European economic unit, European common market. And so when that thing was formed, there was 10 nation members. And now it's fluctuated some back in 2. But at the time of the rapture and the tribulation period, there's going to be 10. That's what the Bible says. Okay, so that's sort of where we are, right? And so this picture, this image, is obviously of a man because it represents the history of human civilization. Not a complete history, but the kingdoms that would portray a critical role in Israel's history until God sets up his kingdom. So the enormity of this image represented humanity's inflated sense of its own accomplishments. So this is strictly a man deal, right? Man sees his accomplishments as something great and splendid. Man has accomplished these great things. And I mean, we would all have to agree, wouldn't we, that some of the accomplishments of man in our modern days have been quite nice. I mean, the technology that we have, if it's used well, if it's used for good, it's quite nice. You know, it's made life easier. I mean, if you think about where farmers have come from, where they are today, I mean, how would you like to plow a mule? Kevin? Me either. I mean, Kevin's got a 250 horsepower tractor. I mean, how would you like to plow 250 mules? That'd be quite burdensome there. But man has accomplished some great things, things that have made life more comfortable for us. But we also would say that these new things have brought some new problems as well. Because that cell phone and that Google this and Google that, man, that's just, you know, boy, that's easy. That's nice. Well, that thing can track you too. And when you Google stuff like what's the best medicine for so-and-so, they decide what you get. And so it could be misleading too. And so technology has brought on other problems. And so these things have brought enormous problems, actually. So it could be easier that we can make a living, easier to make a living, but it's a lot harder to make a life. That's right. That's right. So use the technology. In some cases, you actually may not have a choice. I mean, our banking system, Ellen, has got to where ain't much of a choice. I mean, it's direct deposit, direct debits, and eventually, when we get to a cashless society, there won't be no options. I mean, all that'll be set up, and you'll play by those rules. I mean, if you have a cell phone, you play it by their rules. But in our mind, it's like we can't do without it. Alright, so the interpretation starts with Nebuchadnezzar as this head of gold, because it was Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian Empire, that took, they're the ones that captured Israel, so to speak. They took Israel's authority away. So that transferred world authority from God's people to the Gentiles. So this is where it begins then, the age or the time of the Gentiles. So any reference that you see in the Bible, where the Bible says the times of the Gentiles, that is a reference to when this started, when he came into power. And when you read a reference to the latter days, we're talking about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ until now. We are living in the latter days. So when you read the Bible and you hear those two references, that's what it means. So we're not only living in the times of the Gentiles, we're living in the latter days as well. All right, so Nebuchadnezzar's rule ended the era of Jewish power. And so until Jesus Christ comes, the nation of Israel and the city of Jerusalem is going to be trodden down and controlled by Gentile nations. And we know that to be true. I mean, it was one world empire after another. And then when Christ came on the scene, the Romans were in control. And then they were, when the temple was destroyed, they basically were dispersed. And they didn't become a nation again until 1948, right? And they have been dogged ever since. Absolutely surrounded by enemies. I mean, think about it. To their west is the Mediterranean Sea. That might be the only ally they got. Because north of them is Damascus and Syria and Jordan, Arabs, enemies. And to their east is Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. And to their south is Egypt. They're all enemies, surrounded by enemies. They all hate them. And that's obvious today. And so anybody that hates Israel is allied with them. And anybody that's allied with Israel are hated by the rest. And so that's where the USA is, right? I mean, in the Middle East, the Arab countries refer to America as the Great Satan because we're allied with Israel. And that seems to be fading as well. And so the day's going to come when the USA is going to be blackmailed into turning our backs politically, economically, in every way, militarily. We will be blackmailed into turning our backs on Israel. And then the Bible clearly says, I will bless them that bless you, and I will curse them that curse you. And so that's going to become a curse for us. And so God's hand's going to be withdrawn. Now that'll happen. I just hope the rapture takes place before. We should be praying for a rapture. Next sound I want to hear is a trumpet. I mean, this is getting really, really bad. And I haven't figured out yet, and this is personal opinion now. I have humble but accurate opinions. I can back them up with scripture. But if it's just an opinion, it's just an opinion. But I haven't figured out whether we're under God's judgment already, or is God going to be merciful? And I think the next couple of years will be an answer for me. Now, that's just a personal opinion. So Nebuchadnezzar's rule then ended the era of Jewish power. So until Christ comes, the nation of Israel and the city of Jerusalem are going to be trodden down and controlled by Gentile nations. And of course, we know that the Muslim temple is on the side of the Jewish temple right now. Now, verse 37 says that Nebuchadnezzar was a king of kings. So he was a true monarchy. He was a king that wielded unlimited power. He made the rules, enforced the rules, changed the rules at his whim. And when we get to the fiery furnace episode, we're going to see where, he makes his image. He says, bow down. And that was a rule. And 3 of them boys, they didn't bow down. They weren't playing ball. And so into the fire they went. And then after they got out of the fire, he was like, oh, your God's greater than my God. Changed his mind again. Now, later on, when these guys come to power, Darius and Cyrus, they had a rule, a law, that if the king made a rule or a law, it couldn't be changed. And the reason for that is they thought that they were infallible. So that if they made a rule or a law, then it was accurate. Wasn't no need to change it. That's how full of themselves they were. But that's also a part of the reason why they were the silver and inferior. Because this is an oligarchy ruled by a few, which is not a good political system. And then you get these guys ruled, they were an aristocracy, which is yet an inferior political system. And these guys were just all about military might, which is still yet an inferior political system. And so that's why it went gold, silver, bronze, and iron, as far as that is concerned. But nobody makes swords and spears out of gold. It's too soft. But you do out of iron. And so the political gets less, but the strength gets more. Because this is stronger than that, which is stronger than that, which is stronger than that as far as a metal. I mean, gold's soft. You could scratch it. All right, so that's sort of the reasoning behind this image, gold, silver, bronze, and then the political systems that go along with it. So he's king of kings, a true monarchy. He rules with an iron fist. He had unlimited power. He just makes rules, changes rules, just whatever at his whim. And he just had that kind of power. But he often made rash decisions, like he did with the burning fiery furnace. I mean, we're going to get to it later, but these 3 guys with Daniel, they're his loyal, trusted servants in high levels of government. He turns his back on them just like that. And so he makes rash decisions. And then later he'll calm down. But sometimes you done something stupid. Right? So Nebuchadnezzar was a brilliant man. I think he was a genius. I think he was exceptionally intelligent. Certainly he was well educated, well trained, and he'd done a lot of good things. Herod the Great done a lot of good things. If you just look on the surface, what he did, the things he did. I mean, he built roads, he rebuilt the temple. I mean, he done a lot of good things, just for the wrong reasons. So he was brilliant, well educated, well trained, done a lot of good things. So he's represented as this head of gold because he was the first world empire, and that his political system was the best. So the head of something is often used to mean the beginning, and so this was the beginning of world empires. Now historically we know that Egypt was in power at a time, the Assyrians were in power at a time, but neither of those, the Hittites, the Philistines, none of those groups of people ever controlled the known world. They controlled half of it or their area. But Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar was the first monarch or the first king to rule the known world at the time. And then it was Medo-Persian, then Greeks, and then the Roman Empire. And there hadn't been one since then. And we also should remember they were never defeated. They just ceased to exist. That's why the Bible refers to that this is going to be a revived Roman Empire. It never was destroyed. It's still there. It's going to be revived. That's what the Bible says. So we should also note that his form of government was the ideal type, and therefore he gets the gold title. He's the King of Kings. And so after that, it goes down here. But Daniel now is careful to remind him that it was God that allowed him to rise to such prominence. God's the one that gave him this dominion, this power, this might, and all this glory. Verse 38 says, wherever men dwell, the beasts live, the birds fly. God's given them power over, giving you power over them, but it's also your responsibility too. All right? In 39 and 40, Daniel then explains that the other three empires would follow. And so what he's telling Nebuchadnezzar is, listen, it ain't gonna last forever, boy. I raised you up, and I'm gonna take you down. God raises up kings, and he takes them down. He raises up presidents, and he takes them down. God's in control. I mean, sometimes we look at things going on, and we're like, Lord, just remember, you ain't smart as God. God knows what he's doing.
It's a blessing to know that God is in control, isn't it?
Yeah.
A lot of people don't, you'll hear them just talking, and you think that they really think, hey, he ain't calm.
They ain't. My Danielle said one time to me, she said, that girl thinks she's all that in a bag of chips. I still ain't really caught on to that. But I think I know what she meant is that she thinks more highly of herself than what she ought. And
Sometimes a
so,
bag of chips are pretty good.
yeah. So he explains then that these other three empires would follow. And so it wouldn't be long then before the Medo-Persian Empire would conquer Babylon, and then, your party's up. Your party's up. And so he ruled about 40 years, him personally, and then his empire lasted about 21 more years after his death, and then it fell to the Persians, Medes and Persians in 539 BC. So the next empire then is represented by the silver and was considered inferior. I think I've already gone over that. It'd be inferior metal to gold. And I think I've mentioned that the chest and arms represent the two powers coming together. And so this empire then began with Cyrus in 539 BC. And he ruled about 10 years. And then his older son, Cambyses, took over. And I don't know if I pronounced that right. He died in 522 BC. Then Darius the Persian took over. And so all total, the Medo-Persian Empire lasted about 200 years to about 331 BC, 330. Then the Third Empire, inferior steel, took over. That's the bronze, which is an inferior precious metal, but harder, because by the time of the Bronze Age, Alexander the Great was using that to his advantage. I mean, they had bronze helmets and bronze shields, and an arrow couldn't penetrate that. Now they had to learn to deal with its weight and stuff, but boy, they were pretty tough guys. They had bronze helmet, shields, swords, and everything, so they could protect themselves, and they were fast. Horses had come along. I mean, Alexander the Great, he had it figured out now. He had it going on. He was a great general. I would say in the ancient time, he was probably the greatest general, military commander that the ancient world ever knew. And the son of Philip of Macedon, and so his father started the business, and I think he was actually murdered, and then Alexander took over. He wasn't 20 years old around. And so he died at age 33. So in 13 years, he whips everybody. And then it's told by historians, secular history, it's not recorded in the Bible, of course, that he literally cried because there were no more armies to beat. There was no more kingdoms to conquer. I mean, he was just passionate about that. I think about in more modern times, George Patton, a brilliant military guy. I mean, you have to take him for what he is and agree with him on some concepts. But Patton was a brilliant general. He knew what was going on in the world. He was a great strategist. I mean, he could see that battlefield, and it's almost like somebody playing checkers with you, and you make the first one or two moves, and he says, "You're beat." Like, well, we ain't even started yet. You beat. And so, say again?
What was your comment then? I said, what was your comment to that?
About being beaten checkers? So, well, let's quit. Let me see, who was that I was playing that told me that? Anthony Crump.
Now, Anthony liked checkers.
Anthony was a great checker player. And I remember playing him one time, and after two moves, this is where I get the illustration, he said, "You beat." I said, "Well, how do you know that?" He said, "You're beat." Okay.
And were you?
I was. He demonstrated. But Anthony was a good checker player.
He was good.
Really good. Actually, he was really, really good playing checkers. So Alexander the Great then, his army then was famous for the fact that they had the bronze helmets, bronze swords, shields, and they took over in lightning speed. And in other places of the Bible, in Daniel, when we get to it, their empire was likened to a leopard. There was the lion, the bear, the leopard, and then the Roman Empire was a nondescript kind of all kinds of crazy thing. But the leopard was representative of speed. I mean, in 13 years, Alexander the Great conquers the known world. That's a huge empire. We're talking about from India all the way over to the Mediterranean Sea, and then south down to Egypt, and north all the way up to Turkey, Asia Minor. That's vast. So that's incredible what he was able to do. A great general, and he had a passion for war. And I was following up on that, like Patton had a passion for war. I mean, in World War II, if the country wasn't, you know, sick of war, he was like, let's whip the Russians while we're here, because they're gonna be next. I mean, he knew what was going on. We already got the army here, we might as well whip them too. And Truman was like, what? We can't do that. We gotta quit. But that's how passionate he was. But he was also brilliant in that he knew what those guys were up to and what they were about. And if Truman had let him go, we may not have had near the problems. Because there was a Cold War for years, right? I mean, Pat knew what he's talking about, but I think the country had enough of war by then. So it wasn't politically the right thing to do. It might have been militarily the right thing to do, but it wasn't politically. So history records that when he conquered all the armies, he just sat down and cried. And he dies at 33 years old. I mean, what a story that is. And then after his death, then his empire was split between his 4 field generals. And so I made notes on that. Antipater was the great general, and he wound up with the Macedonian and the Greek area. And then Lysimachus, I ain't sure I'm pronouncing that right. I spell it for you, if you like. But he was in control of the far north, the Asia Minor, Turkey area. And Seleucus was in Asia, and Ptolemy was down in Egypt, in Palestine. So he controlled Israel. So those were the 4 generals. And the Bible also talks about that later on in Daniel. We'll see where Daniel predicted that too, that his kingdom would be divided into 4. So, God is extremely accurate. And the reason for it is he's already there. Because God transcends time. I mean, he sees the past and the present and the future all at one time. And, I mean, he knows what he's doing. He's God. God's powerful. He's powerful. So by 31 BC, then Rome has started to get going. They actually started in like 60 BC, but by 30 BC, they pretty much got everybody built. So it takes them 30 years what it took Alexander 13 to do. They were slow, methodic, powerful, crushing. They just stamped everybody out that was in their way. And so they represented then this legs of iron and the strength of iron. So by 30 or 31 BC, Rome has subdued all these kingdoms. And so the Greek Empire then lasted, I don't know, depending on how you reckon time and when it stopped, 250 or 300 years. And so a lot of times it sort of depends on what definition is used. So the 4th empire then was Rome. This is the legs of iron, a yet inferior metal as far as politics are concerned, and as far as value of the actual metal. Gold, most valuable, silver, bronze, then iron. And so history records the Roman Empire beginning in about 63 BC, and it lasted to about 475 AD. And as I've mentioned time and time again, nobody beat them. They just ceased to exist. They just were corrupt. And they extremely corrupt. Politically, they just couldn't control that vast empire. It was costing too much money. They couldn't get people to pay the taxes, of course. I mean, it just got too big for them to manage. And it just ceased to exist. And so Roman rule was in power when our Lord came, and it was Roman rule that put our Lord on the cross. And it was imperialistic Rome that ruled ruthlessly throughout the world the days of the early church. And so they persecuted the early church. All those emperors, Nero in particular, persecuted the early church relentlessly. Never defeated, just ceased to exist. In the later days, the Roman Empire then was split in two, and I think I've already mentioned that. In verses 41 to 43, we see yet a future or a later phase of this fourth empire, and it's symbolized by the feet and the toes. There's 10 toes. And so it's made up of iron mixed with clay. So these verses clearly imply that this final phase will be made up of some sort of federation. All right? But yet future. And this is going to be the revived Roman Empire. So the iron would represent the old Roman culture, the old Roman tradition, and the clay would represent the inherent weakness of a socialist society. See, that's what happened to Rome. They became basically a socialist society. They had so many guys in the army trying to maintain everything, Kevin, their agriculture was failing. Now, in my mind, I might be biased, but I think, this is a personal opinion, that the first reason, or the major reason the Roman Empire failed is because their agriculture failed. They had too many people toting spears and swords. There wasn't enough people farming.
You ain't got nothing to eat, you ain't gonna fight long.
Navy. My Navy girl. How long can a nuclear submarine stay under?
I believe that's classified. I don't know.
Let me answer it for you. Till the food runs out. I don't care how long it can go or how deep it can dive. It's only going to be down there as long as they can get food on.
On a ship, you start running out of this, okay, we got this. Now we ran out of that, okay. So you're kind of going down the chain of what you run out of and now what we can eat. And that's on a ship.
Yeah, so the point is they neglected their agriculture. Everybody wanted something for nothing. And so it turned into a socialist society. Now, where are we headed? Right here in this country. Just as fast as we can. And here's the mind-boggling thing to me. I tend to be a rational, logical person. And sometimes that can be dangerous. In that, logically and rationally, who would ever want to be in a socialist society when history says it's never, ever worked? It never will work. But yet we want it. And we're destroying the very foundations that are holding us up. Here's an illustration. This represents a tower. This represents the 14th floor. It could be the 15th or 20th, take your pick. But the point's going to be the same. So you're living on the 14th floor in a high-rise building, and every day you come home from work and you chip away at the foundation. It's going to fall. And everybody from the 14th floor down to the first floor is going to die. Everybody will die. That's socialism. So where's the logic in your living high on the hog, like we are here, spoiled rotten, great way of life, got it easy. We're living on the 14th floor, and as a culture and as a society, we're chipping away at the foundation. We're destroying the family unit. We're destroying people's incentive to work. And we think socialism is going to work. It won't. I don't understand that. The only way I can understand it, John, or explain it, is that it's just satanic. is just plain satanic. I mean, the things that are going on in our world today are just plain, like child sex trafficking. I mean, can anything be more ungodly than that? There's going to be a hot place in hell for those people. A hotter place. It may even be hotter for them than for Adolf Hitler. But we're allowed as a society. That's not in my notes. But yet, verses 41 to 43 is that later phase of this fourth empire, and it's symbolized by the feet and the toes. And so the clay then represents a socialist society. You got iron mixed with clay. So iron represents the traditional, the strength, and the clay represents weakness. And clay don't mix with iron. And so what we got here is, out of this mixture of iron and clay comes weakness, confusion, disunity, and class struggle. That's what beat the Roman Empire. So these verses tell us of a time when the revived Roman Empire is going to consist of 10 kingdoms or 10 rulers, represented by the 10 toes. And when we get to the 7th chapter of Daniel, we're going to see this in more detail. And so it's going to be much clearer then. Earlier in these verses, we saw that a stone, verse 34 says, you saw this stone that was cut out of a mountain, and it was cut out without hands. Well, that stone represents Jesus Christ. And so with this new Roman Empire, this revived Roman Empire, it's going to be the European common market. When it's revived, the stone, Jesus Christ, is going to crush it. And then the eternal kingdom is going to take place. And in our Revelation study, we covered that in detail, right? So here's some prophecy of it, right here. You'll destroy the revived Roman Empire. That's the reference. That's the image. The feet of clay, the feet of iron and toes and all mixed with clay, and the stone hitting the feet. That is the picture of the revived Roman Empire during the tribulation period when Jesus Christ will destroy it, and then his rule will take over, and it will last forever. So this is what Daniel is telling Nebuchadnezzar. This is what's going on in world history from your time right on to the end. It's represented right here. The world empires, and then eventually Roman, it ceased to exist. It comes back to life. Its feet are of iron mixed with clay. And Jesus Christ, that stone, is going to smash those feet. And that new world empire is going to be destroyed. So in modern times now, what's going on is the world is lining up for a one world government. There's lots of examples. There's a World Economic Forum that's run by a bunch of Satanists and atheists, and they are determined to sink the dollar and reset everything so that there'll be one world currency that they will control, of course, in their wisdom, and then everybody will be slaves. Now, when that happens, we'll be out of here, but that's what's going to happen. Climate change, global warming, whichever term you want to use, is an absolute farce for those of you that are watching on that. It is a lie out of the pits of hell, and it is nothing more than an attempt to unify everybody on a concept so that other things will be easier for us to unify on. That's all it's good for. It's all about politics, and all the lies they tell is just phenomenal. I've studied it in detail, how it is that 95% of the scientists in the world agree on this. 95% of the ones that were sitting at the table had already made up their minds agree. But the other thousands of scientists are saying, whoa, wait a minute, that ain't right. And you don't hear them. And so you Google climate change and see if you get anybody that talks against it. No. Google has got it set up such that they will tell you what you need to know. And so you just need to be aware that you Google something, chances are the results that you get are going to be what Google wants you to know. And it may not necessarily be all the truth. All right? Never be destroyed in stone. All right. Now we're in verse 46. I think I might be a little bit ahead of my notes here. My turn? I've covered that. Some application points. God's in control. What's wrong?